The block I'm going to build uses 2-inch strips or 2-inch squares. So the first thing I do is go to my scrap storage system. I want to make my blocks dark, either black and brown and cream. The way I organize them, I put like strips together and then I have the fold facing out so I can just grab that unit, or I have some that were remaining from strips, so I just cut those into squares right away. So I just go through and grab my light and dark squares. Now, I would like these organized, but in order to do that, I would sit in the evening by the TV and organize these into certain colors, and then they'd be easier to access. I've been cutting scraps, and instead of putting them away, I just keep stacking them on the lid because this is the mess I have. This winter, I did make 3 quilts out of here, but I just keep adding to it. It's going to be a rainy week coming up, so I think I'll sit and organize them. I like to have them organized by color, and then I have them stacked in here. And on this side, if there's a strip just barely big enough to make a 3.5-inch square, I just cut the square right away and I just pile them in here. And in some instances, I might have leftover 3.5-inch units. So I just stockpile them until I have enough to make a quilt. But in this case, this is where I'll draw from my black and brown. Maybe that will work. That's how I pull from my scrap user system. Just take 4 individual squares, lights and darks, arrange them like so. When you take them to the sewing machine, I would just lay one over the other, and then I would just feed them through the sewing machine. Then I would just press to the dark. And notice I didn't cut between them. I left the unit intact so all the pieces of that little unit stick together when I remove them from the sewing machine. And then I would lay this over. I feel until I nest the seams. You can kind of feel when they seat together, and then again sew with your 1/4-inch seam, and when you open it up, you'll have your 4-patch. Made these little kits for a class. The size I used, these are my 2-inch squares, and I took my 2-inch strips and then just made a little kit of the darks and the lights. This is for another part of the block. So then you can align your light and dark strip and piece the strips. When you sew strips together, make sure that you can't see the bottom through the top or the top through the bottom. Align perfectly for the best results. Then you can just keep chain stitching both pieces of your kit. Then since these will be sewn together, I'm just going to kind of nest the seams together. Here's my stitching, and I'm going to take one of these lines. Let me just take a dark one. If you're going to line up the edge of the fabric, depending how carefully you sewed, the edge might be a little frayed or bowed. Since these are 2-inch strips, cut the units into 2-inch strips. So before I cut, I just make sure everything's going to fit within the 4. So these are waist, and then these are ready to go to the sewing machine. You will sew that 1/4-inch, and then when you press it open, you'll have your little 4-patch. When I prepare the 4 patches, stack several blocks on top of each other, and I just make sure everything's aligned. And you can pin. I'm not used to pinning, so I just kind of do this without thinking. But please pin if you feel more confident to do so. I would just keep feeding them through like that. And since these two are a unit, I'm going to reach back, not cut the first one, but the second one. And this was my little leader, my half square triangle. And I just finger press. The heat and pressure of my fingers is enough to help set the seam. And then I'm flipping the seam to the solid square. Just finger pressing. See, they're connected, so these two I had matched before on this board. Then if you want to pin so your seams match, pin just right below your stitching line. Can't really see my stitching line, but it's right here. And I pinned right below there. Make sure my fabric is aligned. And when I get right to that thread, then I'll pull the pin out. Make sure you manipulate the fabric. Don't let it go wherever it wants. See, and then everything is still lined up here. I don't have extra of the bottom unit hanging out or the top skewed. They're all lined up. Okay, then I'd cut the next one. I like working in groups of 2 blocks. When one is finished, I'm feeding in the next one. It's maybe just a different way to work. Most people I sew with, they have automatic thread cutters. I don't. So it probably doesn't bother most people. This is just how I like to sew. And then the one in the back should be done. With the Carrie Nation block, you'd have your double 4 patch, and then you'd also make a 4 patch out of the larger units. This is what you'd have. Just for comparison, these are 1.5 inch squares, and then when 4 are sewn together, it's 2.5 inch. So this would be an 8 inch block. So this is how you'd lay out the center, and you just keep building, adding blocks all the way around. Oops, I moved that because these two would have been side by side. And when you work with scraps, if you don't want 2 blocks side by side, you have to do a little shuffling. This is what your barn raising setting would look like. But you can also start with an X in the middle and go out from there if you'd like. So there'd be a giant chain through your quilt, and that's what that would look like. Hope you have fun setting this block.